Is it?
This is it.
I had no idea.
This is it. It's Thursday. It's noon. I was on FreightWaves Now yesterday, and I was like, welcome back to FreightWaves, Freightonomics.
Welcome back to Freightonomics on a Tuesday morning.
Yeah, I was jumping the gun. But this is Freightonomics, and I'm Anthony Smith, Chief Economist here at FreightWaves, and I'm joined by the one, the only, Zach Strickland, the Sultan of Sonar himself, head of Freight Market Intelligence.
I mean, that's what they call me.
You are really like the engine within Sonar and the market expert team that really kind of ties it all together. And sometimes I don't think you get enough credit.
I don't know. I feel creditable.
Okay.
Credited.
That's enough for me. I don't want you to get too big of a head. But this is Freightonomics, where we combine freight and economics together. And this is the show, the podcast that you didn't know that you needed, because there's a lot going on in the freight world and the supply chain world, of course, over the last 2 years. And there's definitely not been a dull moment within our macroeconomy. And Zach, we got a bunch to talk about today.
Yeah, I mean, the rail strike, obviously the biggest news of the week. Hopefully you tuned into FreightWaves Now this morning and saw Joanna Marsh and Mike Bowdendistel give the latest scoop on that and details. Now, I guess the bottom line, Anthony, is that there's no strike.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were just going about their day like, nobody, I don't think a lot of people realized how big of an impact this would have had on their daily lives. Even if you don't have anything to do with logistics and transportation, it would have been a tremendous thing. And I guess the thought here, Anthony, is that everybody's kind of waiting on what's next. Like what are the things that are coming up that we can't see, that everybody's trying to get back to this pristine living, that was like this post-Cold War environment and we did have some bumps along the way, but they were relatively predictable. Like the housing market collapsed in 2008. Tons of people saw that coming. Greed run wild. It's part of it. But we came back and it was like a super stable climate, for about 6, 7, 8 years, really, until things started to get wonky. And then, of course, COVID comes along. So the theme of today's show is what's next and what are some of the risks that are still sitting out there that we're not necessarily paying attention to.
Yeah, and there's a lot to jump in through all that. And if you see me looking down periodically, I'm not being that rude, only a little bit rude. Mm-hmm. I am looking at LinkedIn. So if you're watching on LinkedIn right now, and I see a few of you are, jump into the comments. You have any takeaways throughout the show, the talking points, you have a hot take, you have a question for Zach, you want to get him canceled, whatever it might be. Jump into those LinkedIn comments if you happen to be watching on LinkedIn at 12 Eastern Standard Time on this Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, and with that being said, I got to give the people what they want, Anthony. They want their market update in less than 2 minutes.
Let's do it.
In less than 2 minutes. So I think we're all queued up and ready to go. Of course, for those of you that haven't been watching, this is my attempt at giving you a quick recap and also a little update on what the freight market is doing domestically with sometimes a little international twist. So, Anthony, if you want to do the honors and count me in.
Let's go. 3, 2, 1, begin.
All right. First up, we have the outbound tender volume index. This measures the electronic tenders between shipper and carrier. The more requests there are, the higher demand is for transportation, which means if this index is elevated, as it has been over the past 2 years, demand is also elevated. And we are currently about 22% below where we were last year. Most of those tenders, however, were rejected last year. So we're still seeing relatively high demand compared to the previous few years. Something to take away from this chart, however, you see there's a little bump, a little nook there on that white line. That's the current year. And a little bump here after Labor Day. That is something to watch, even though it does look like it might be a little bit of seasonality as shippers tend to ship a lot of freight right after Labor Day. We will have to wait and see, check in for a little update on that. Let's move to the next chart, which is our tender rejection index. Of course, the higher this index is, the tighter capacity is. 5.44% as it stands this morning. Not a lot to get concerned about at this point. Anything below 6% considered relatively deflationary. So tender rejections capacity seems to be under control for the moment. Let's move to the next chart and look at our NTI and our NTIL. NTI in the white line is an all-in spot rate measurement. The NTIL removes the total estimated cost of fuel. And you can see both of those actually do have a little bit of a nook or a little bump on them on Labor Day. Problem is, we're still in that period where Labor Day might be having an influence, but it's still something worth watching here in the coming week or two to see if rates have still upward pressure on them. And last but not least, this is going to be my big takeaway of the week. Oh, aloha, the average length of haul for freight moving across the United States. The white line there showing a pretty big little jump. Seasonally, we expect longer haul freight this time of year, which could be the strongest impact on tightening capacity moving forward.
Boom.
Bam.
There it is. There it is. Market into. So Zach,
Market into.
starting to see a little bit of a tick up after this Labor Day. As you mentioned, this could be seasonal. This is supposed to be peak season, right?
Now, peak season, technically, it depends on your perspective. There's peak seasons for different carriers and commodities out there. Like right now, for instance, the Pacific Northwest. If you were reading the Daily Watch for those Sonar subscribers out there, you'd know that it's harvest time out there. Apples, of course, the majority of our apples, and I think the world's apples actually come out of Washington State. Michigan, of course, has an apple harvest, but not to the same scale as Washington. But the traditional peak season, that people talk about is that retail peak, that holiday time. So all these consumer demand really drives a lot of that. And that has been the thing that has been degrading over the last, several months. We were kind of overstimulated. We talked about that on previous shows. And inflation digging into people's wallets.
And that's a big one, and it hasn't slowed down. I mean, we got the latest CPI numbers that we'll talk to in a little bit here, up 0.1%. And it doesn't seem like a huge monthly movement, but when you look at all the underlying trends, it's very significant because we got a flat movement last month. And that flat movement was really, I think, a lot of people's just like sigh of relief, like, but one of the things that we said is like, hey, the only thing that moved down was gas and energy prices. Everything else remained elevated.
I kind of want to touch on this real quick before we get into the news of the day, which obviously will, be around a lot of rail. But my big question here is we've had months, of interest rate increases.
Yeah.
And you look at the rate of inflation, it's obviously not having a strong impact on it, Anthony. And if you're in the Fed at this point in time, why are you thinking that raising interest rates at the pace we are is actually going to have this level of impact? I mean, I've talked about this. I personally believe that it is totally out of the Fed's control at this point. Most of the inflation that we are seeing is a supply side inflation, which is largely driven by outside forces outside of the domestic United States.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors that go into it because, like you said, that supply side issue, the amount of stimulus that was deployed throughout the pandemic that really kind of started the surge of demand throughout the beginning of the pandemic and throughout the midst of it, really. And then now you also have the supply chain issues throughout. So there were these issues with our infrastructure that have been there for quite some time, and it was really exposed throughout the pandemic, throughout this huge spur of demand. And so now what we're seeing here is that the Fed, a little bit too late, now looking to raise interest rates. I think there is a worry there around inflation, and there's this strange dynamic that happens at the Fed. It's like we said in earlier podcasts that they almost treat it like a quarterly call because they have to be very precise with how they phrase things because they can't incite any panic. They can't try to really derail activity or really perceptions of the economy. So, for example, throughout the beginning or the midst of the pandemic, they said there was going to be an inflation, and if there is an inflation, it's going to be transitory. Now, fast forward, here we are. We're in the midst of some really bad inflationary times, and now we're hearing that, hey, this isn't a recession. There's no recession to be had. Even though we've had back-to-back quarters, there's no recession.
I don't get it.
There's going to be like this just trying to ease and cool whatever it is that's going on.
Yeah.
But I think in the back room, things are just on fire. And I think this is just going to be one of those things where, okay, we have to get inflation under control. We have to increase interest rates as much as possible because on the back half of this thing, when it gets really, really bad, we're going to have some type of leverage to pull. I think that calm that we were talking about a little bit earlier on in the show throughout, post 0809, we saw a lot of issues that were being done with lowering interest rates at, near 0% and really kind of influencing the stimulus in the economy and this quantitative easing that now I think is coming to fruition in addition to the stimulus packages that were deployed. We're talking about taking money out of the American economy or diminishing some of that spending power, essentially. And so That's going to be the building block, of course, of the U.S. economy. Also, it's almost talking about both sides of the mouth here. So we look at
Right?
this inflation bill, the CHIPS Act, things like that. It
Has
has
nothing to
almost
do with
nothing to do with
inflation.
inflation.
Yeah.
So, and it's increasing spending from the
Yeah.
government, which needs to come down. And so there's all these variables that seem to be
Yeah.
counterintuitive at the moment.
Yeah, and I get that they're trying to prepare for what they feel is probably imminent in terms of economic recession. They want to have something in their quiver there that they can stimulate demand with. But in my opinion, I just don't see this being like the soft landing scenario is kind of out of their hands. And I just feel like they're going to make it actually deeper and worse.
Mhm.
And that's going to contribute to the longer term problem. Anyway, I obviously am not,
And I think
equipped.
mentioning that, I
Yeah.
think Jerome Powell has a decision to make. Does he
Yeah.
take the Paul Volcker approach from the late 70s, early 80s and just say, hey, you know what? We're going forward with this interest rate hike
Yeah.
despite any type of recession, no matter how bad it gets? Or does he pivot and say, hey, okay, we're going to keep going until we see deterioration substantially in the employment market and we see notable substantial decline in the macroeconomic environment as well?
I've said it before, the financial sector likes to do something in response. Sometimes doing nothing is the best
Yeah.
activity, in my opinion. But again, we'll see how it plays out. Let's move on to the news and the newsonomics, the stories that obviously have the biggest influence on our freight market and also supply chains. So obviously the biggest story of the day comes from the rail sector. The strike averted this morning. A lot of people taking deep breaths here because this was literally this could have really done some damage to the economy. You're not just talking about the intermodal volumes, which, I talked to Mike Bowden-Distel about this, and it really wasn't about that. It was more about like the coal and some of these bulk commodities that were, really they're the backbone of our industrial economy. They're the power grid, things that we cannot live without.
Right.
Run on these rail cars. And that was the concern here, is that we would have had significant damage. It's not like, I think some of the truckload carriers were like, sweet, we're going to get some extra volume.
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably would have, but it's this type of freight isn't necessarily going to have that strong of a push in the short term, which I think a lot of people thought this strike would have only been a short-term impact. But this is, $2 billion in lost economic output every day is what they estimated. I don't know necessarily what that number truly means, but if we pull up the chart that I have here, O-Rail, for those of you that are operating in trucking, did we see any significant change in the intermodal market? No, not really. Look at the all those lines there. They're loaded container volumes in Sonar here, outbound loaded container volumes for both domestic and international. And you can see year over year, almost no change. They're flat. So don't expect a big push of truckload freight out of this one.
So Zach, the scope of this potential strike that could have happened, was this going to be like a one-day thing, or was this planning just to be ongoing until terms were met?
Yeah, I think this is one of those situations where unions can do some legitimate, good for their members.
Yeah.
Not that they don't. Obviously, they're there to provide support and systems. And when you're talking about things like the rails, which are essentially monopolies,
Yeah.
the employees don't have a lot of leverage there. And I think over the last few years, and again, if you listen to the people there, it wasn't necessarily about a wage increase, but it was about quality of life. Seriously, watch the FreightWaves Now segments this morning on this, and it was, if you look at some of the railroad ORs, as we talk about here on Freightonomics, you're talking about 58 ORs. This is a 42% profit margin. They got room to make some concessions here. This is, and it's not their fault. They're just doing what they're supposed to do. They're keeping their costs down, expanding their margins because they have no real ability to grow their exposure to the market. They already have it.
Right.
It is what it is. And you're not going to put up more railroads.
Yeah.
They're actually coming down. So in this scenario, it's kind of an, older term scenario where, industrial era type dynamic that these guys were underpaid, and
Yeah.
their quality of life did need to come up to standards, because you commit to being a railroad engineer, that's what you do. They don't have a lot of other options. So I think this was good overall. I think this needed to happen, and the crisis averted for now.
We have some comments here. Donna Rand says, "Good morning." Good morning to you as well, Donna. Dwayne Murdoch says, "We need a truckers union."
I mean, there are unions for truckers out there. There's several now. The problem with that unions being applicable to trucking, it's a totally different scenario. You're talking about multiple competitive units in trucking, whereas in rail, that infrastructure is set and hard coded. So as a trucker, you can leave.
Yeah.
You can start your own business. The barriers to entry in trucking are unlike most in our economic environment. You can start your own business. Now, that's not to say that there's not some level of buyer beware here.
Yeah.
You can't just go pick up your truck tomorrow and start running. There's scaling dynamics, and you got to be careful. You start working for a company that says, "Hey, lease purchase program." You end up in this, "I can't afford to purchase this vehicle for perpetuity" situation, kind of that old coal miner situation, the company stores, if you will.
Right.
So you do have to watch out for that. But in general, there's just too many options. There's too much competition in that to make it applicable.
It always seems like when there is any type of unity within trucking that, it starts to come together. There's a momentum building, sometimes on Facebook, all these other social media. Then it just kind of falls apart before the big moment.
Eventually, that free market capitalism kicks in, and they gotta pay their bills. They gotta make their rent. They can't go on strike. They can't cut. There's owner operators in general have trouble coming together because there's too many individual interests there to really make a strong push. But that being said, there is another story out there that I thought was very relevant to today's topic and Eric Coolidge wrote this one. Transport strikes put supply chains under duress again. And these are largely strikes outside of the domestic United States. But they are, most of them, you really can't strike without a union.
Right.
And that's why a lot of the owner operators they can't get it together, is because they don't have a union, something that pushes them together without being like, you know what, I do have to pay the housing bill.
Right.
And it's happening all over the world. And now I know most people in the United States are like, why do I care? Well, if you've learned nothing over the last 2 years, what happens abroad definitely impacts us, because we have become a global supply chain. If you cut off airflow in Britain and France, which is part of what's happening in this article, the air cargo is threatening to shut down. That disrupts airline networks. If those planes aren't coming over here, there's freight that they had scheduled to move over here, may not happen. And then the Port of Felixstowe, again on the map, the workers at the ports of Felixstowe and Liverpool are preparing to strike. This is 48% of the container volume in Britain. If Britain has trouble getting their freight, those boats are stuck, and the containers that are set to go there, they can't just divert.
Right.
Well, they can divert, but they still have all this cargo. They can't get it unloaded. So it clogs up the global supply chain. So that's why you need to keep a close eye on all these little, I don't want to call them mini events, but they're definitely events that are smaller than a COVID, but they have an impact downstream.
And this is something that's happened, I think, since the beginning of the pandemic. When we saw the recovery, vaccines, cases coming down in the U.S., one of the big things that we're talking about here was that, hey, we're recovering faster than the rest of the world is right now. And so demand is coming back online, goods and services, things like that. But a lot of the goods and services that we were consuming, especially goods, coming from overseas. And now they can't really ramp up production at the same rate that we are consuming it. And that was a big issue. Another big thing that's happening overseas right now that I don't think a lot of people are really having their eye on, that Rachel Premack and John Kingston highlighted a few weeks ago, was around the oil situation and coming out of Russia. And so that coming up into these winter months, these peak energy season, essentially, we could see an increase in oil prices rather soon.
Yeah, will Europe have enough fuel?
Yeah.
Because it's cold over there,
Yeah.
and they're already kind of worried about the deficit that they have, and if they don't have Russian gas, then that's going to inflate the price of gas here as well. So it's all an interconnected web, and it's kind of like we're set up. We're really in uncertain territory, economically speaking. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's so many variables, but if I were to go into like Doctor Strange mode and just look at all the outcomes that this can go,
Right.
there's very few scenarios where there is just like a soft landing and we just
Yeah.
kind of come out this unscathed. Because even if that were to happen, it's almost like kicking the tire a little bit further down the road to a much worse situation.
Yeah, and I know that I've talked to a lot of people about forecasting. Budget season is coming up. You've got to set up your budgets for next year. Nightmare scenario here. Something that we use, obviously, here, our tender data helps us kind of adjust because we don't know what's going to happen to, you can predict, like all that these forecasts do is apply history forward. So, whatever history they deem the most relevant, these forecasts are designed because they're not thinking algorithms. I know everybody likes to hear about AI.
Yeah.
If you can't program AI in 15 lines of code.
Right.
The human mind is very complicated to replicate when you're talking about adaptation.
Yeah.
And programming adaptation into forecasts, you have to make it aware of the trillions of variables that could possibly change over the next period of time. And I think that's kind of the lesson here, is that you need to figure out which variables do you deem the most important. My question to you is, what do you see looming at this point over the next, let's just call it a 3 to 4 month? Like, what is the biggest thing that you're going to watch if you had to pick one or two things to watch here in the next few months?
I would say the jobs market.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just so many different variables within the jobs market. I mean, you have the quit rate, which is starting to come down a little bit. So people aren't quitting as much.
Yeah.
You have the participation rate, which is still below pre-pandemic levels. It eased up ever so slightly. Even though we have initial jobs claims coming down, I think it's to a 3-month low thereabouts in the teens, 213,000 thereabouts. There's still an uncertainty around that because we're seeing a substantial slowdown in hiring. When you look at the payrolls report from ADP, when you look at the JOLTS report, when you look at job openings, we're seeing that there's a slowdown in hiring. So that's telling me, okay, these consumers are going to have fewer opportunities, even though there's over 11 million job openings right now. Hiring is slowing down substantially. I'll be watching everything within the jobs market because that's going to be telling on how these consumers are going to be able to stay afloat with utilizing credit cards. The student loan forgiveness thing is in a sense going to be inflationary building because you're giving more spending power back to the people.
I got to ask you this. Isn't the wage growth the solution and also the problem in this situation?
So I think Jerome Powell, I think what he would like to see, and he can't say this, I think he would like to see unemployment tick up a little bit because that would give people a little bit less spending power. So fewer purchases happening, less demand. Okay, now demand comes down, prices start to come down because there's not such a demand for these things. The problem is right now it's hitting essential goods like food and housing and things like that. So
because people can't afford basic things at a certain level. And I think all these unions, are recognizing that they are undervalued economically speaking. And they're citing inflation rates of 12, 13%, and you only gave us an 8% raise.
Yeah.
What do you do in that scenario?
I think for one thing, on the business side, businesses have been taking on inflationary hits that are outpacing consumer hits.
Right.
And so they haven't even passed all those along. So they're still taking some hits, even though it came down, I think, 0.1% for the PPI in the most recent report. So they have to either keep taking those hits and keep hiring or slowing down on the hiring, or substantial layoffs to ease some of their margins that they have kind of been eroding a little bit because you're looking at these inventory issues. They have too much of the wrong inventory. Now they have to do these fire sales, not get the due value that they were looking to get to secure their funds that they're going to have for that quarter or whatever it might be. In the terms of the Federal Reserve, they're in a tricky situation because they're going to have to try to increase interest rates, do a Paul Volcker 80s move here, and really just kind of say, hey, I don't care about what's happening with the markets. I don't care about what's happening with any kind of political pressure. I just care about the interest rates and inflationary pressures. But like you said, this might be the wrong tool to fight that. And even if it's the right tool, is he going to jack it up to 10%,
Yeah.
12% like we saw in the 80s? So
That-
that's going to be the other big question here.
Basically telling these companies don't spend money at all.
Yeah, capital expenditures. And
we go, I don't know. That's a hard one for me to wrap my head around just yet. But no soft landings. You heard it from Anthony Smith here, and that's going to about turn us off for this week's Freightonomics. Thank you for watching, of course. You got any closing thoughts for the people?
Even if we are in the midst of a recession, it doesn't have to be a recession for you. Even if you're an individual or a business, if you make the right moves at the right times, I know it sounds cheesy a little bit, but you don't have to go through what the rest of the world is going through. So plan accordingly, save your money, make sure that you are in the right position to weather the storm.
Get granular with it and
Yes.
stay classy, world.